The street was quiet, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the suburban neighborhood. It was just past midnight when Chief Mark Reynolds turned onto his street, exhausted from a 12-hour shift filled with back-to-back calls, paperwork, and the usual chaos of running a police department. All he wanted was a hot shower, a cold drink, and a night of uninterrupted sleep. Instead, he slammed his brakes the moment he reached his driveway. A massive tow truck was blocking it. His driveway. For a moment, he thought it was a mistake. Maybe a neighbor's car had broken down, and they were using his driveway as a temporary tow spot. But then, his gaze landed on the smug-looking guy standing beside the truck, arms crossed, with a clipboard in hand. Kevin, the HOA enforcer. Or, as the neighbors liked to call him, the wannabe cop. Mark exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel. Not tonight. He didn't have the patience. He got out of his car, his badge still clipped to his belt. "You want to move this truck out of my driveway?" he said, keeping his voice even. Kevin looked him up and down like he was some random civilian. "Should have paid the fine, bud," he said with a smirk, tilting his head toward the empty space where Mark's personal car had been parked that morning. A slow, creeping realization settled in. His car was gone. Towed. Mark ran a hand down his face. "For what?" Kevin chuckled and lifted the clipboard dramatically. "Let's see, unpaid fine of $79. Mark blinked. $79? "Yeah. We sent notices. No payment. No warning needed when you ignore M. "Warn what?" "I was at work all day." Kevin shrugged, flipping through the clipboard like it was some sacred text. "Not my problem. Rules are rules." Mark clenched his jaw. He'd never ignored an HOA fine in his life. Sure, they sent ridiculous notices now and then, one time for having a bird feeder that wasn't HOA approved, but he always handled them. This, however, was something else. He pulled out his phone and checked his emails. Sure enough, buried under spam and work notifications was an email from the HOA. Subject: Final notice, urgent. Past due balance, $79. Sent 3 hours ago. Mark let out a slow breath through his nose. He looked up at Kevin, who was still grinning like he had just won some battle. The tow truck driver, a bulky guy in his 40s, leaned against the truck, looking bored. "Where's my car?" Kevin tapped the clipboard. "Impound lot. You can get it back for $250 plus storage fees." Mark's eye twitched. "So, let me get this straight. You towed my car over a $79 fine, before I even had a chance to read the email, then blocked my own driveway with this truck." Kevin's smirk widened. "That about sums it up." Mark cracked his neck. He had arrested gang leaders with less arrogance than this guy. He took a step forward, keeping his tone calm. "Move. The truck." Kevin held up a hand. "Oh, I can't do that. You gotta settle the fine first. It's policy." Mark reached for his phone, dialing the non-emergency dispatch. A young officer picked up. "Hey, it's Reynolds. I need a traffic obstruction unit at my residence." Kevin's smirk faltered slightly. Whoa. What do you think you're doing?" Mark stared at him. "Getting your truck moved. Legally." The tow truck driver stood straighter, eyeing Mark's belt. "Hey man, are you a cop or something?" Kevin scoffed. "Doesn't matter. This is HOA jurisdiction. Cops can't do squat." Mark took a deep breath. He'd had enough. "Oh, that's cute," he muttered. He walked toward his mailbox, flipping it open. Sure enough, there was a physical notice inside. He skimmed it quickly. Effective immediately, Chief Mark Reynolds has accrued additional violations totaling $500. His eyes darted down. Violations: improperly installed porch light. Lawn not in uniform, HOA standards. Unauthorized mailbox decor. Mailbox decor? Mark looked at his plain black mailbox. There was nothing on it. Then it hit him. The tiny blue police support sticker he had on the side. They fined him for that? Kevin was enjoying himself too much. "Oh yeah, you got more fines stacking up, buddy. This is just the start. You homeowners think you own the place, but we run this neighborhood." Mark turned back toward him, his expression unreadable. "You run this neighborhood?" Kevin nodded, crossing his arms. "That's right. So you better play by the rules." Mark let out a slow breath. "Okay. Got it." Kevin seemed to think he had won. "Good. Now, if you want, I can waive some of the additional fines if you pay tonight." Mark held up a hand. "Don't bother. I've got a better idea." He walked back to his car and leaned against it, waiting. Kevin frowned. "What are you?" Flashing red and blue lights filled the street. The real police had arrived. 2 officers stepped out, both in full uniform. The senior officer, Sergeant Miller, approached with a confused expression. "Chief, what's going on?" Kevin's face went pale. "CH Chief?" Mark crossed his arms. "Oh, didn't I mention? I'm Chief of Police." Kevin visibly swallowed. The tow truck driver froze. Mark gestured toward the HOA tow truck blocking his driveway. "This vehicle is obstructing my property. I'd like it removed immediately." Miller turned to Kevin, his voice all business. "You got a permit for this tow?" Kevin fumbled with his clipboard. It's HOA policy, sir." Miller raised an eyebrow. "Policy isn't law. You have no legal authority to impound a vehicle without following proper city ordinances." Mark turned toward Kevin, his eyes locked onto him. "You were saying something about running this neighborhood?" Kevin's mouth opened and closed. Mark smirked. "Yeah, that's what I thought." The silence after Mark's revelation was deafening. The smugness drained from Kevin's face so fast it was almost comical. The tow truck driver took a subtle step back, as if hoping to disappear into the pavement. Mark tilted his head, letting the weight of his words settle in. "What's wrong? You were real confident a minute ago." Kevin stammered, gripping his clipboard like a lifeline. Look, this is just a misunderstanding, Chief. HOA policy says." Mark raised a hand, cutting him off. "You keep saying policy. Let me explain something to you, Kevin." His voice was calm, measured. "Policy is not law. You don't have the authority to impound vehicles. You don't have the right to obstruct private property. And you sure as hell don't have the power to fine people for imaginary violations." The tow truck driver turned to Kevin. "Wait, hold on, you said this was legit." Miller, Mark's sergeant, stepped forward, arms crossed. "You two better have a valid towing license on file with the city. Otherwise, this is a legal impoundment." Kevin's face twitched. We have one." Miller glanced at his partner. "Run it." The younger officer nodded and stepped away to check the tow company's credentials. Mark shifted his focus to Kevin, enjoying the sight of the self-proclaimed HOA enforcer shrinking under pressure. "While we wait, why don't you tell me what these other fines are about?" He pulled out the letter from his mailbox and unfolded it. Kevin's eyes darted toward it. "It's all in the HOA regulations." "Lawn too high." Mark glanced at his neatly trimmed grass. "Wrong mailbox decor?" He tapped his small police support sticker. "Porch light too bright?" "Are you serious?" Kevin, scrambling, tried to regain control. "Listen, these are standard neighborhood rules. Everyone has to follow them." Mark nodded. "Right. Let's test that theory." He turned to his sergeant. "Miller, pull the property records for HOA Board President Richard Vaughn. Let's see if his property has any violations." Kevin's reaction was instant. Whoa, that's private information." Mark smirked. "Not to law enforcement." Miller's radio crackled as the younger officer returned. "Sergeant, the tow company's operating on an expired permit. They've been illegally towing vehicles for 6 months." Mark's grin widened. "Kevin, that's a crime." The tow truck driver threw up his hands. Whoa, I didn't know that. I just do what they tell me." Mark gestured toward the officers. "Then I suggest you start cooperating." "Where's my car?" The driver fumbled for his phone, sweating. I'll call the lot. They'll bring it back." Kevin's panic was growing. "Hold on, let's just talk about this." "Oh, we'll talk," Mark interrupted, stepping closer. "About why you think you can extort homeowners with fake fines. About why you target certain houses while letting your buddies slide." He folded his arms. "And about how you just impersonated law enforcement by threatening people with enforcement powers you don't actually have." Kevin took a step back, his bravado gone. "It's not like that, I swear." Before he could finish, headlights flooded the street. A black SUV pulled up, and out stepped Richard Vaughn, the HOA president himself. Unlike Kevin, Richard had a slick, politician-like confidence. He adjusted his tie as he strolled up, surveying the situation. "Chief Reynolds," he said smoothly. "I didn't expect to see you here in uniform." Mark turned to him, unimpressed. "I wasn't expecting to find my driveway blocked and my car stolen. But here we are." Richard barely blinked. "This is all just a misunderstanding. I'm sure we can handle this internally." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, you mean like you handle everything else? Illegally? Through threats and fines?" Richard's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Our HOA has the right to enforce community standards. If you've received fines, it means you were in violation. Just like every other resident." Mark turned to Miller. "That report." Miller handed him a printout. "Richard Vaughn's property records. Let's see here." Mark held it up dramatically. Unapproved backyard structure. Overgrown hedge. Porch light out of HOA standard. Unauthorized flag display. He raised an eyebrow. Should I keep going? Richard's face stiffened. Mark glanced at Kevin. How much are these violations worth again? Kevin swallowed hard. Oh wait, I forgot. You don't fine your own people. You only go after the ones who won't play your little power game. Richard's voice was cold now. Careful, Chief. I know people. Mark chuckled darkly. Yeah, so do I. He gestured to the uniformed officers behind him. Richard's eyes darted to them. Now, no need to get the police involved. Mark smirked. Oh, but I insist. Miller stepped forward. Sir, we're officially launching an investigation into HOA financial misconduct. We have multiple reports of selective enforcement, illegal towing, and fraudulent fines. We'll need to audit the HOA's accounts. Richard visibly tensed. That's ridiculous. You have no right. Oh, we do, Mark cut in. And guess what? Tampering with HOA funds? That's a felony. Richard's fake confidence crumbled. Kevin looked like he was about to faint. The tow truck driver's phone buzzed, and he snatched it up like a lifeline. Yeah. Uh-huh. You found it. Okay, bringing it back now. He hung up and turned to Mark. Your car's on the way, Chief. Mark nodded. Good. Now move this truck out of my driveway. The driver scrambled to obey. As the tow truck pulled away, Mark turned back to Richard. You're gonna want a lawyer, Vaughn. Richard glared, but he knew he had lost. Kevin, meanwhile, was trying to sneak away. Mark called after him. Not so fast. You're under arrest for unlawful vehicle seizure and impersonation of law enforcement. Kevin's face went ghost white as the officers moved in. Richard hissed through clenched teeth. You'll regret this, Reynolds. Mark smirked. Doubt it. As Kevin was cuffed and Richard fumed, Mark took out his phone and snapped a photo. Say cheese, he muttered. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But tonight, the wannabe cops just got a taste of real law enforcement. And Mark Reynolds wasn't done yet. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had completely changed. Just minutes ago, Kevin had been gloating, thinking he was untouchable, and Richard Vaughn had arrived in his sleek black SUV, expecting to intimidate his way out of the mess. Now, Kevin was in handcuffs, the tow truck was being forced to leave, and Richard was quickly realizing he had lost control. Mark leaned against his squad car, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. He let the tension sit for a moment before speaking. Richard, let's talk about your finances. Richard's face tightened. I have nothing to hide. Mark smirked. That's funny, because according to our preliminary records, the HOA has been issuing fines at an unusual rate. He glanced at the printout Miller had handed him earlier. But what's really interesting is where the money goes. Richard scoffed. The community fund, of course. It's all legal. Mark raised an eyebrow. Legal? You sure? Because it looks like a significant portion of it has been transferred to an LLC, one registered under your name. Richard's eyes flickered, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. You're reaching, Chief. HOA board members can receive administrative compensation. It's in our bylaws. Mark gave a slow nod. Right. But you see, here's the problem. You've been charging extra fees beyond what's legal. And even worse, you've been targeting specific homeowners, anyone who challenged your authority. He held up a list, including myself. Richard's smile faltered. Kevin, still in cuffs, turned his head toward Richard. Wait, you said the fines were legit. Mark let that sit for a second before delivering the knockout punch. Oh, Kevin, you really thought you were working for a legitimate operation? Kevin's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He told me everything was above board. Richard shot him a look. Shut up. Mark chuckled. Not much of a team player, huh, Richard? He gestured toward Kevin. You might want to listen, because Kevin here has a decision to make. Kevin frowned. What do you mean? Mark folded his arms. Oh, it's simple. See, Richard is going to throw you under the bus the second this goes to court. He'll say you were the one organizing the illegal tows, that you were the one issuing fraudulent fines, that you're the mastermind. Kevin visibly paled. But that's not true. Richard made the calls. I just enforced them. Mark leaned forward. So, Kevin, do you want to be the fall guy? Or do you want to cooperate? Kevin panicked. I don't know. Richard hissed. Don't be stupid, Kevin. He's bluffing. Mark turned to Miller. Sergeant, if Kevin cooperates, how much leniency could the DA offer? Miller shrugged. Could be significant, depending on what he provides. Kevin licked his lips. He wasn't smart, but he wasn't dumb enough to go down alone. I want to talk to a lawyer first, but he turned to Mark. Yeah, I'll cooperate. Richard stiffened. You traitorous idiot. Mark smirked. Oops. Richard finally lost his composure. You think you've won, Reynolds? You're just a cop. You have no power over the HOA board. Mark's smile didn't waver. Oh, but I do. He turned to Miller. Time to bring in the big guns. Miller nodded and dialed a number. Within minutes, a city inspector and a fraud investigator arrived. Richard watched them approach with growing panic. The inspector walked up, adjusting his glasses. Which one is Richard Vaughn? Mark nodded toward Richard. Right here. The inspector flipped open a thick folder. Mr. Vaughn, the city has received multiple complaints regarding HOA financial misconduct, selective enforcement, and unlawful property seizures. Based on preliminary evidence, we are launching a formal audit into the HOA's financial records. Richard swallowed hard. You can't do that without a warrant. The inspector smiled politely. Actually, we can. Because the HOA is a non-profit organization, it falls under state audit laws. Richard turned to Mark. You planned this. Mark grinned. Yep. The fraud investigator stepped forward. Mr. Vaughn, we also have reason to believe you've been personally embezzling HOA funds. I'd suggest you prepare for a deep dive into your personal accounts. Richard was speechless. Kevin let out a low whistle. Damn, dude. You're so screwed. The officers tightened Kevin's handcuffs and loaded him into the squad car. Richard stayed rooted in place, his world crashing down. Mark took a step closer. You said I had no power over the HOA? Richard swallowed but said nothing. Mark smirked. Looks like I just took it all away. Richard's fists clenched, his entire body shaking. This isn't over. Mark raised an eyebrow. You're right. Because now we're coming for your board. As the fraud investigator and city inspector headed inside the HOA office, neighbors started coming out of their houses. Some were recording. Others were whispering. The once powerful HOA president now looked like a trapped animal. Mark turned to the crowd. If you've been targeted by bogus fines, now's your chance to come forward. A murmur rippled through the neighborhood. Richard took a step back. You can't do this. Mark gave him a cold smile. Watch me. The power had shifted. And Richard Vaughn? He was about to lose everything. The neighborhood had become an arena. Neighbors whispered amongst themselves, phones recording as the once untouchable HOA empire came crashing down. The smug arrogance on Richard Vaughn's face was gone, replaced with barely concealed panic. He stood stiffly, sweat forming at his brow as the fraud investigator and city inspector marched into the HOA office. Mark crossed his arms, watching Richard's false confidence crumble. The man had spent years running this community like a dictatorship, hiding behind policy and community standards to squeeze money out of innocent homeowners. Now, he was a deer caught in the headlights of real authority. Kevin, still in cuffs, leaned against the police car and laughed. Damn, Richard. Looks like your little scam's over. Richard snapped. Shut up, Kevin. Mark smirked. He's right, you know. You're finished. Richard straightened his tie, his desperation barely masked by fake bravado. This is all circumstantial. You have no proof I personally stole HOA funds. Mark nodded toward the fraud investigator, who had just emerged from the HOA office, holding a fat stack of paperwork. The investigator smirked. Actually, we do. Richard's entire body stiffened. The investigator held up a printed bank statement. Mr. Vaughn, would you like to explain why HOA fine money was transferred to a private account under your name? Richard blanched. That's an accounting mistake. Mark chuckled. Oh, of course. Because mistakenly depositing thousands into your personal account happens all the time, right? The fraud investigator flipped through more pages. Let's see. HOA funds paid for your personal vacation to Hawaii. HOA funds covered luxury car payments. And my personal favorite, he pulled out another document. $8,000 spent at a steakhouse. Neighbors gasped. One elderly woman, Mrs. Jenkins, shook her head. I've been fined $500 for planting tulips. But he's out here stealing thousands for a good time. A younger man in the crowd, Mr. Patel, clenched his jaw. He threatened to foreclose on my house over a $200 fence violation. Mark turned to Richard. You really pissed off the wrong people. Richard's mask cracked. You can't just arrest me. I'll fight this in court. The fraud investigator sighed. You'll have plenty of time to prepare your case. Because I'm placing you under official investigation for embezzlement and financial fraud. A hush fell over the crowd. The investigator turned to Mark. Chief Reynolds, do you mind doing the honors? Mark smiled. With pleasure. He stepped forward, pulling out his cuffs. Richard stepped back. You have no right. Mark's expression hardened. You had no right to steal from this community. No right to target homeowners with illegal fines. No right to use HOA money as your personal slush fund. He grabbed Richard's wrist and snapped the cuffs on. Richard Vaughn, you're under arrest for financial fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The crowd erupted. Cheers, claps, and laughter filled the night. Mrs. Jenkins pumped her fist. About damn time. Kevin, still in cuffs himself, cackled. Man, this is so much better than reality TV. Richard thrashed. You can't do this. This is my HOA. I built this. Mark leaned in. Yeah. Well, consider it condemned. Two officers stepped forward, grabbing Richard by the arms and leading him toward the squad car. Before they shoved him inside, Richard turned his head, spitting venom. This isn't over, Reynolds. I'll get out of this. I'll get lawyers. Mark shut the door. Yeah. See you in court. The squad car pulled away, Richard's screams fading into the night. Mark turned back toward the fraud investigator. So, what happens next? The investigator nodded. The state will take over. Every fine he issued will be reviewed and likely refunded. His assets will be seized pending trial. Miller stepped up. And the HOA? The city inspector folded his arms. Under review for dissolution. At the very least, they'll have to elect a new board. The crowd erupted into cheers again. Mark grinned. Well, folks, looks like your HOA nightmare is over. The entire neighborhood cheered. Mark glanced at Kevin, still in cuffs. And what about him? The fraud investigator sighed. If he cooperates, he might get a plea deal. Otherwise, he's looking at some serious charges. Kevin swallowed hard. I'll cooperate. Mark smirked. Smart choice. One of the neighbors stepped forward. Jim, the retired Marine who had butted heads with the HOA for years. Chief, I gotta ask, he pointed to Mark's house. You ever think about running for HOA president? Mark laughed. Oh, hell no. I deal with real criminals. I don't have time for whatever the hell this was. The neighbors roared with laughter. Jim smirked. Well, I guess we'll need someone new to run things around here. Mrs. Jenkins nudged him. Not it. The laughter grew louder. Mark finally exhaled, running a hand through his hair. What a damn night. His squad car was waiting, but before he left, he turned to the crowd one last time. For what it's worth, if you ever need backup against another HOA like this, he tapped his badge. You know who to call. With that, he climbed into his car and drove off, leaving behind a neighborhood finally free from the tyranny of a corrupt HOA. And as far as Mark was concerned, justice had been served. The chaos of the night had finally settled. The corrupt HOA was crippled, its enforcers either in handcuffs or hiding, and the neighborhood was buzzing with victory. Mark stood outside his house, hands on his hips, watching as his neighbors celebrated their long-awaited freedom. A few feet away, Sergeant Miller was speaking with the city inspector and fraud investigator, finalizing the next steps. Richard Vaughn was gone, locked up pending trial, and Kevin had been hauled off separately to start his cooperation process. Mark stretched his sore shoulders. He had arrested armed criminals, violent gang members, and career felons. But something about taking down an HOA tyrant felt especially satisfying. Maybe it was the pettiness of it all. The neighbors crowded around him, excitement in their voices. Jim, the retired Marine, clapped him on the back. Chief, I think you might have just made yourself a neighborhood legend. Mrs. Jenkins, still clutching her phone from recording the whole event, grinned. We should frame that arrest photo of Richard. Put it right in the community center. Mark chuckled. Might be the first thing the HOA ever did that people actually liked. Jim smirked. Speaking of, I'm guessing we're getting a new board? The city inspector, overhearing, turned to address the group. Yes, under state law, a homeowners association must be given the opportunity to elect a new board if the current leadership is found guilty of misconduct. He adjusted his clipboard. Given the scale of corruption here, we're putting the entire HOA charter under review. A murmur of interest spread through the crowd. Mr. Patel, still holding the notice of his bogus fence violations, scoffed. You should just dissolve the whole thing. A younger woman nodded. Seriously. After everything they've done, do we even need an HOA anymore? The inspector raised a brow. That's up to the homeowners. If there's a majority vote, the HOA can be disbanded permanently. Mark saw the light bulbs go off in the crowd. Jim grinned. Oh, I think we know where this is going. Mrs. Jenkins raised her hand like she was back in school. All in favor of burning this HOA to the ground? Nearly every hand shot up. The inspector laughed. Well, that was easy. He made a note on his clipboard. I'll process the paperwork. If the majority wants out, the HOA will be officially dissolved. The crowd erupted into cheers. Mark couldn't help but smile. Justice wasn't just about taking down criminals. It was about fixing the damage they left behind. And these people, they were finally getting their freedom back. Jim grinned at Mark. You sure you don't want to run for HOA president before we burn it down? Mark laughed. Not a chance in hell. Mrs. Jenkins smirked. What if we rename the HOA? Call it the Reynolds Protection Association. Mark shook his head. Nope. If you need me, just call 911 like normal people. The crowd roared with laughter. As the investigators continued their work, city officials announced that all fraudulent fines issued under Richard Vaughn's leadership would be revoked and refunded. For many homeowners, this was life-changing. Mr. Patel wiped a hand down his face. You have no idea how much stress this has caused me. I was this close to selling my house just to get away from these people. Another neighbor, an elderly man with a cane, sighed. They tried to foreclose on my place last year over a tiny landscaping violation. Mark clenched his jaw. How many people had suffered under these parasites? The city inspector stepped forward again. Additionally, the funds illegally seized by Richard Vaughn will be redistributed to the affected homeowners. A stunned silence followed. Mrs. Jenkins gasped. Wait, so, we're getting our money back? The inspector nodded. Every penny we can recover. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then cheers erupted again. Mark glanced at Miller, who smirked. Not bad, huh? Mark exhaled. Not bad at all. The next morning, the HOA office was shut down. A big red notice of investigation sign was plastered across the front door. All operations were suspended, and Vaughn's remaining board members resigned in disgrace. Kevin, hoping to save himself, started spilling everything. He gave up Richard, the corrupt tow companies, even the private blacklist Vaughn kept of homeowners he wanted to harass. It was the final nail in the coffin. By the end of the week, the entire HOA structure was dismantled. The signs, the ridiculous rules, the oppressive fines, all of it was gone. Neighbors started repainting their mailboxes however they wanted. Lawns grew freely. The air in the neighborhood felt lighter, as if the weight of tyranny had finally been lifted. A few days later, Mark received an unexpected email. From, redacted at citygov.com. Subject, HOA property seizure update. Mark opened it. Chief Reynolds. As part of the fraud investigation, Richard Vaughn's personal assets have been liquidated. His private property, purchased using stolen HOA funds, has been auctioned. One of the properties seized was his personal vacation home in Florida. The winning bidder? A coalition of your neighbors, led by Mrs. Jenkins and Mr. Patel. Mark blinked. He reread the last line twice. Then his phone buzzed. A text from Jim. Dude, we bought Vaughn's beach house. HOA Revenge Tour 2025. Mark burst out laughing. This was poetic justice. The entire community came together, not just to take back their neighborhood, but to take back what was stolen. Mark leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with amusement. HOAs were a plague. But at least in this town, one of them was finally dead. And Richard Vaughn? He was exactly where he belonged. Behind bars. Mark sat on his front porch, watching the sunset bathe the neighborhood in a golden glow. For the first time in years, the street looked normal. Peaceful. No patrol trucks. No clipboard-wielding enforcers. No ridiculous violation notices taped to doors. Just homeowners enjoying their hard-earned freedom. He took a sip of his coffee, letting out a long breath. It was over. And yet, his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Mark glanced down. His entire inbox was filled with messages from homeowners all over the country. You have no idea how satisfying that takedown was. My HOA is just as bad. Any advice on fighting back? I think I just watched the best revenge story in history. I need an update on what happens to Richard in court. Chief, please tell me this is going to be a series. HOAs are out of control, and we need a hero. Mark chuckled, shaking his head. A hero? He was just doing his job. Well, maybe with a little extra flair. The final nail in the HOA coffin. Later that evening, Mark got an update from Sergeant Miller. Richard Vaughn was officially indicted on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and financial misconduct. With Kevin's cooperation and mountains of evidence, the case against him was airtight. The former HOA president was looking at serious prison time. Kevin, true to his word, rolled on everyone, revealing other HOAs involved in similar shady practices. His testimony opened a full-scale investigation into multiple HOAs across the state. Mark could already hear HOA board members panicking. The neighborhood reborn. With the HOA officially dissolved, the community wasted no time erasing all traces of its rule. The first order of business? A bonfire. Jim, the retired Marine, started it. One by one, neighbors tossed old HOA violation notices into the flames. Some added copies of the ridiculous rulebook, while others gleefully burned their last HOA fee statement. Mrs. Jenkins made a special edition, a giant poster of Richard Vaughn's old campaign for HOA president. Mark watched as the flames ate it up, turning the once feared enforcer into nothing but ash. Poetic, isn't it? Jim smirked, sipping a beer. Mark chuckled. I'd call it justice. A new call to action. Mark checked his phone one last time. His inbox wasn't slowing down. There was a pattern in the messages he was getting. People weren't just celebrating the takedown. They were asking for help. Stories of corrupt HOAs, unfair fines, ridiculous rules, and abuse of power were flooding his inbox. People were desperate for solutions, for guidance, for someone to fight back. Mark leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The battle against one corrupt HOA was over. But there were thousands more just like it. And if there was one thing he had learned, it was this. Most HOAs only had power because nobody stood up to them. Maybe that needed to change. Maybe it was time to take this fight national. He opened his social media and typed, "Is your HOA corrupt? Have you been fined for ridiculous reasons? Tell me your story. Let's bring these power-hungry tyrants down. Together." He hit post. The future of the fight. Mark didn't know what would happen next. Would this become a movement? A series? One thing was for sure. HOAs weren't prepared for what was coming. Because now, homeowners had a weapon. A very public, very determined chief of police who wasn't afraid to shine a light on their dirty secrets. And as Mark watched his post explode with responses, he knew one thing for certain. The war against corrupt HOAs was just getting started.